The moment the hovercraft doors closed behind her, Katniss Everdeen felt the weight of choice pressing harder than ever. Peeta was gone, captured, or worse. District 12 was ashes. The rebellion waited on her to lead. But deep inside her, something else stirred, something darker, quieter, and far more dangerous than defiance: exhaustion. A longing not to fight, not to rise, but to disappear into the numb luxury of forgetfulness. When President Snow offered her a way out, not with threats but with open arms and the whisper of comfort, she hesitated for just a second too long. And that second was all it took to shift the course of Panem's fate. He came to her alone, without guards, on a balcony overlooking the capital's glowing skyline. "You're tired of being their symbol, aren't you?" he said, voice smooth as silk. "The rebels will use you just as I did, only they'll let you burn when you're no longer useful. But I can protect you. I can give you peace." Katniss thought of Prim, but even her face was fading in the whirlwind of death and fire. She thought of Gale, and of his bombs. She thought of Peeta's screams echoing through capital airwaves. Maybe, just maybe, if she played along, she could save someone. Maybe herself. She nodded. The transformation was slow, deliberate. The capital paraded her through recovery, her image reshaped carefully by stylists, her bruises covered, her posture corrected, her fury repackaged into sorrowful wisdom. Caesar Flick Kerman interviewed her again, this time not as the girl on fire, but as the voice of reason urging unity under the capital's generous rule. The people of Panem watched in confusion as their mockingjay turned her wings inward. Districts rioted. The rebels screamed betrayal. Effigies of Katniss burned across District 8. But President Snow smiled. He had won something far more powerful than a battlefield. He had turned the spark of rebellion into an ember of obedience. Katniss lived in the presidential palace, a puppet draped in silk and adorned with jewels. Her new quarters overlooked Capitol Square, and every morning she awoke to the scent of roses pumped through the vents, suffocating and sweet. Her meals were extravagant, her clothes designed by an imprisoned Cinna, who had traded his freedom for her life. He never saw her again. At night, Katniss would lie in her bed, the satin sheets cool against her skin, and stare at the ceiling where golden patterns flickered. She told herself it was for Prim, for Peeta, for Gale. But they never came. No one wrote. No one reached for her. Only Snow visited, always with a glass of poisoned wine in hand that he never drank. He never had to threaten her again. Her silence was its own prison. The rebellion raged for months. Without her, their symbol faltered. District 13's broadcasts tried to spin her defection as a ruse, a mission, a trap. But when Katniss appeared on Capitol News holding the hand of President Snow and speaking of forgiveness, the illusion shattered. Rebels deserted. Bombs fell. The Capitol tightened its grip. Years passed. Snow died, not by rebellion but by age and time. A peaceful transfer of power followed. Panem was reorganized. The districts remained, but surveillance increased. Mockingjay insignias were outlawed. Hunger Games continued, now under the banner of tradition, not punishment. Katniss was assigned a new role, ambassador of national unity. She traveled from district to district, face serene, voice empty. Children cheered. Adults watched with silent fury. She saw familiar faces sometimes. Deli Cartwright in District 12, now a mother. Greasy SAE with grayer hair. Even Haymitch once, drunk as ever, his eyes burning with something she couldn't name. He didn't speak to her. He turned and walked away. Peyton never resurfaced. Rumors said he died in a capital cell, others that he escaped and lived in hiding. Katniss hoped for the former. Hope was dangerous. One spring, during a capital festival commemorating the peace she supposedly helped achieve, Katniss stood on stage beside the new president, a young woman named Aurelia Crane. Children danced, music played, doves were released. The Capitol roared. And Katniss, smiling softly, imagined what it would be like to pull an arrow from her sleeve and end it all. She didn't. She clapped along, lips curled in the perfect mimicry of joy. That night, she returned to her quarters alone. The rooms were silent. The roses were wilted. And as she removed her ceremonial gown, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She no longer looked like the girl from District 12. Her eyes were dull. Her hair fell in perfect capital curls. The scar on her arm from the first Hunger Games was gone, removed by surgeons. She touched the spot. It felt like it had belonged to someone else. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was the last thing she had managed to smuggle out of District 13, a mockingjay pin. Tarnished, bent, but intact. She stared at it for a long time before setting it on the windowsill. Years later, school children would study Katniss Everdeen as a symbol of reconciliation. Her defection would be praised as a turning point in Capitol policy. A museum wing was dedicated to her in the Capitol archives. Paintings showed her draped in peace banners, eyes shining with wisdom. But the truth, the quiet truth buried in classified files and forgotten testimonies, was simple. She had given up. Not out of weakness, but out of weariness. She had traded fire for silence. Rebellion for safety. Survival had become her rebellion. And in the end, the Capitol didn't need to kill her. They only had to keep her comfortable. She died at 72, in a soft bed under crisp white sheets, the mockingjay pin still resting on her windowsill. It was said she smiled at the end, though no one could be sure. Her funeral was state-sponsored, grand, televised. The president declared a national day of unity in her name. But far away, in the deepest parts of District 12's forest, a girl with braids and a handmade bow whispered a different story to her friends. A story of a girl who once sang to the dying, who hunted with her best friend, who volunteered to save her sister. They whispered that maybe, just maybe, Katniss Everdeen had once burned brighter than anyone before the Capitol dimmed her flame. And as the wind blew through the trees, carrying the soft echo of a mockingjay's call, it sounded almost like a song. But that wind did more than whisper stories, it stirred something that had long lain dormant. Deep within the fringes of the districts, past the reach of Capitol patrols and cameras, the legend of the true Katniss began to take root again. Not the state-mandated version, but the hidden truth, preserved in old recordings, in graffiti scratched into stone, in the memories of those who had truly known her. Among these was Rue's little brother, now a grown man, who had survived the war by hiding in the ruins of District 11. He remembered Katniss's hand clutching Rue's, the flowers laid on her broken body. He remembered how the capital had twisted that kindness into a spectacle, and how Katniss had never been the same. He kept her story alive around fires at night, where children sat wide-eyed and silent. In his tales, Katniss was not a traitor but a prisoner, a girl who had given too much, too soon. Meanwhile, in District 13, long abandoned and stripped of military power, a remnant network of old rebels gathered in secret. They called themselves the Ashes, a name born of loss. Most were children during the war, raised on the hope Katniss had once represented. Though the capital believed resistance was dead, in the silence of their underground bunkers, the Ashes plotted the unthinkable, a new uprising. Their leader was a woman named Mara, whose father had died in the Second Rebellion. She had never met Katniss, but wore her likeness on a small pendant made of scavenged glass. It was her mother's, passed down like a relic. Mara studied everything about Katniss, her speeches, her missions, even her silence. She didn't blame her for giving in. She blamed the world that broke her. And Mara was determined to finish what the Mockingjay had started. The capital, bloated by its illusion of peace, had grown complacent. The districts were pacified through distraction and luxury where possible, and surveillance and fear where necessary. The games continued, though less brutal, rebranded as tradition. Tributes no longer fought to the death but competed in elaborate simulations, with elimination instead of execution. The Hunger Games had become a show again, not a weapon. But beneath the surface, the rot remained. In one of the outer districts, a young boy named Lysander won the reaping lottery. It was not something to be feared anymore. He would be safe, fed, entertained. The capital sent drones to record his joy. But Lysander had grown up on whispers and firelight stories. When the cameras rolled, he recited a song. Not one sanctioned by the capital, but the one Katniss had sung to Rue. The lullaby. Sweet and slow. The video went viral. At first, capital citizens praised it for its quaint emotion. But then came the questions. Where had he learned it? Why did it make some older citizens weep openly? And why had it been banned in early capital archives? The Ashes seized the moment. They hacked capital feeds, broadcast the original footage of Katniss singing the lullaby in the arena. It played on repeat across every screen. For the first time in decades, the capital's control faltered. Katniss, long buried in layers of propaganda, emerged raw and real. Children who had grown up thinking her a traitor watched with awe as the real girl flickered on screens, trembling, wounded, fiercely alive. Her silence now spoke volumes. Her surrender, once seen as betrayal, became a symbol of cost. And cost demanded reckoning. In the capital, the ruling class panicked. Aurelia Crane ordered the footage wiped, but it was too late. The Ashes had built networks the capital could not reach. In weeks, protest graffiti appeared in alleys, "Sing like Rue, real not reaped, the Mockingjay fell we will fly." And then, one morning, the unthinkable happened. A young capital official named Cassian Thorne, born into privilege but raised on the edge of curiosity, released classified files from the presidential archives. Among them were journals, Katniss's private thoughts, confiscated and sealed after her death. In them, she wrote of her guilt, her exhaustion, her growing horror at how easily she had been used again. Her final entry read, "If I had the strength, I would run. Not to fight, but to remember. To find that girl in the woods again. The one who fed her sister. The one who sang to a dying child. But I am no longer her. And maybe that's why I must be kept quiet." The leak shattered the narrative. Capital citizens, previously lulled by wealth and illusion, began to question everything. Murals of Katniss appeared, painted in grayscale with a single red flame. Her mockingjay pin returned, not in secret but worn openly. Even in the districts, hope reignited, but with a colder edge, one not of dreams, but of purpose. Mira, leading the ashes, declared the start of the Third Rebellion not with violence, but with exposure. They would not burn the capital. They would unravel it. Over the course of a year, former peacekeepers defected. Capital networks were compromised. Trade routes collapsed under coordinated strikes. What had once required blood and fire now moved through silence and information. A war of truth. And at the center of it all was Katniss Everdeen, the woman who had fallen, and by falling, taught them what not to become. A monument was built in District 12, where her home once stood. Not a statue, just a circle of stone around a single tree, where the mockingjay pin was carved deep into the bark. Every year, on the day of her death, children gathered there to sing the lullaby. And far from cameras, from archives and history books, an old man with a twisted leg and eyes like melted gold came once a year. He brought a loaf of bread and placed it beneath the tree. He never spoke. No one dared interrupt. Panem changed, not perfectly, not forever, but undeniably. The capital fell not in fire, but in memory. And in that memory, the girl who had once set the world ablaze was finally free. Not as a weapon, not as a puppet, but as herself. Katniss Everdeen, the girl who was never meant to survive, had done more than live. She had taught the world how to remember. And sometimes, when the wind swept through the trees of District 12 just right, the mockingjays still sang her name. The new Panem that emerged was a place haunted by remembrance. Schools taught the Hunger Games no longer as a spectacle or sanitized tradition, but as a dark age of control and dehumanization. The names of lost tributes were etched into towering walls in each district, from the long-forgotten fallen of the early games to the final so-called symbolic additions. Rue, Marvel, Clove, Finnick, Wyrus, even those who had died without cameras ever capturing their faces, each one remembered. The name of Katniss Everdeen was not placed there. She had not died in the arena. But her story wound through them all like a thread of scarlet fire. Peeta Mellark's fate, once uncertain, became a myth of its own. Some claimed he had survived and lived out his days in the wilds near the mountains, painting the trees with flower paste and berries, whispering her name into the breeze. Others believed he had died in one of Snow's dungeons long before the war ended. But the truth, buried like so many others, lay in a small journal eventually discovered beneath the floorboards of an abandoned Capitol building. In it were short entries. Descriptions of nightmares. Sketches of flames, dandelions, and a girl with a braid. The final page simply read: "They took her voice. They'll never take her song." The journal was displayed beside Katniss's pin in the National Memorial Archives. It was one of the few artifacts not under glass, allowing anyone to turn the pages and feel the worn edges where hands had trembled. As the years passed, new leaders rose, some from the capital, others from the districts. They were chosen not by bloodlines or fear, but by vote. A council of representatives kept power in check, with a rotating chair chosen every 2 years. Aurelia Crane, disgraced by the uprising, vanished into the edges of the old system. Some said she died in exile. Others whispered she changed her name and lived quietly in District 9, tending to olive groves. No one ever confirmed it. Muro lived to see her vision fulfilled. She stepped down from leadership early, insisting she had no desire to become what she had fought against. In her retirement, she wrote only one book, titled Ashes and Wings, chronicling the rise and fall of Katniss Everdeen. In her closing chapter, she wrote, "She was not flawless. She was not invincible. But she was real. And in being real, she gave us what the capital never could: permission to be broken and still resist." There were no more Hunger Games. Not in any form. The arena was repurposed into a vast garden, filled with trees from every district and birds from across the continent. In the center stood a sculpture, abstract and wind-sculpted, neither flame nor bird, but something between. Visitors came in silence, left tokens, and told stories. One day, many decades after the world had begun to reshape itself, a young girl named Senna visited with her mother. She was from District 6 and wore a red scarf she had knitted herself. Her mother told her the stories on the ride there of the girl who sang, of the games, of rebellion, and regret. Senna listened, wide-eyed, and when they reached the sculpture, she knelt and placed a small item at its base. It was a single dandelion. Bright. Yellow. Resilient. That night, as stars pressed against the sky and soft wind swayed the garden trees, Senna heard a sound. High, echoing, melodic. A mockingjay's call. It was joined by another. Then another. Across the districts, in towns, and farms and cities still healing, mockingjays sang again. Not in mimicry of pain, but in celebration of endurance. Their calls echoed through alleyways and wheat fields, through mines and rivers, over concrete and ash. And in District 12, beneath the same tree where Katniss's pin still clung to bark, an elderly woman sat in silence, eyes closed. Her name was Greasy Sae. Her hands were wrinkled, her voice nearly gone. But she still remembered the songs. She hummed one softly, her breath shaking, and the birds around her picked it up, lifting it skyward. Above her, engraved into a stone placed recently by unknown hands, were simple words. She didn't win. She didn't lose. She changed everything. And in the dreams of children that night, scattered across the new Panem, the girl on fire lived once more, not as a warrior, not as a traitor, but as a soul who bore the weight of a broken world, and in doing so, gave others the courage to rebuild it. The world would never forget her. But more importantly, it had finally understood her. And far above, in the shifting stars and cold clean night, it seemed for a moment as if even the universe bent slightly toward her memory. Katniss Everdeen. Mockingjay. Daughter of Fire. Silent Rebel. Reluctant Martyr. Endless Echo. And the mockingjays sang on. The restoration of Panem was not swift. Though the capital had fallen and a new democratic council governed from a rotating base, sometimes in District 3, sometimes in District 5, the old wounds ran deep. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt, minds unshackled, trust slowly cultivated. One of the greatest challenges wasn't mending buildings, but memories. In the early years, a commission known as the Reckoning was formed to document the truth of the games. Survivors, former peacekeepers, citizens of the capital, and rebel fighters all gave testimonies. The archive grew to tens of thousands of hours of footage, scanned documents, interviews, and records. But through it all, the question that appeared most often was simple. Why did Katniss give in? The people needed to understand not just her legacy, but her decision. The younger generations saw her choice as a strategic retreat. Others viewed it as tragic resignation. And a few still called it betrayal. But when Miro was asked directly in a televised address, she answered without hesitation. Katniss was one of the first to teach us that survival is not weakness. That silence, in a world built to amplify suffering, can be a weapon. The capital used her until she broke. And in breaking, she showed us how to rebuild not as copies of her, but as ourselves. You want her to have been perfect, but she never was. That's why she saved us. The crowd watching that night remained still, silent, not out of confusion, but reverence. In the years that followed, the descendants of tributes played a growing role in politics and art. The granddaughter of Thresh became a poet whose collection Cornblood and Stone was taught in universities across Panem. Glimmer's niece helped dismantle the final remnants of capital weapon depots, traveling district to district in a van painted with her aunt's face and the word freedom spray painted beneath it. Even a distant cousin of Marvel became a peace negotiator, dedicating her life to reconciliation between districts where animosity still lingered. One of the most compelling figures of the New Age, however, was a girl named Cress. She was born in the capital but orphaned during the final strikes of the Second Rebellion. Raised by an old rebel nurse in District 7, Cress knew hunger and cold, but also truth. At the age of 17, she found an old holographic recorder in a collapsed Capitol basement and used it to begin making documentaries. Her first work, Fire Under Marble, was a quiet, piercing look at Katniss's years as an instrument of the Capitol. It featured slow panning shots of the palace's empty hallways, snippets of her silenced speeches, and grainy footage of her last appearances, her eyes hollow. The film premiered at the rebuilt Panem Forum, and when the final scene faded, a lone image of the Mockingjay pin on the windowsill, no one clapped for several seconds. The silence was louder than any applause. Cress's voice broke that silence in a voiceover. She didn't need to shout. She already spoke the loudest, simply by being there. And when the world forgot her voice, it remembered her silence. That documentary sparked a movement among Capitol-born youth, now 2 generations removed from the tyranny of snow. They called themselves the Quiet Rebellion. They didn't carry weapons. They painted murals, sang the old band's songs, and helped rebuild destroyed district libraries, especially in places like 6 and 10, where cultural memory had been obliterated. Their symbol was not the mockingjay, but a cracked silver arrow wrapped in ivy. Meanwhile, in the ruins of what was once the Game Maker's headquarters, excavation efforts uncovered the remains of the last arena ever used for live combat. Below the artificial landscape lay a vast control chamber, untouched since its last use. Among the twisted consoles and shattered screens, a technician unearthed something remarkable: a final, unreleased video. It was Katniss. It showed her sitting alone in a Capitol interview room, unguarded, unposed. The timestamp placed it just weeks before her death. She was older, lined with time, but unmistakably herself. Her braid was tight. Her expression unreadable. She spoke directly into the camera. "I won the games, but I never really won. I lost the moment I was chosen. They took everything from me: my home, my family, my love. And when I couldn't fight anymore, they gave me comfort, knowing I'd be too tired to resist. I don't know if you hate me for that. I don't know if I hate myself. But if there's a chance that someone, someday, can live without being made into a symbol, then maybe all of this meant something." The release of the video went viral across all of Panem. Schools paused for the day to show it. Citizens gathered in open squares to watch it projected against walls. For many, it was the first time they had seen her speak unfiltered, unpolished, unedited. Just Katniss. And it changed everything. The Council of Panem passed a resolution to abolish all existing games-related infrastructure and convert the remnants into public gardens, libraries, and memorials. The final district to resist these changes, District 2, relented after watching the video. Even the old peacekeeper barracks were transformed into music schools and free hospitals. Decades passed. The memory of Katniss softened, but never dulled. Her likeness was never immortalized in gold or bronze, only in things that grew: gardens named after her, sanctuaries for mockingjays, shelters for the displaced. And then, on what would have been her 100th birthday, something extraordinary happened. An old woman, nearly blind, arrived quietly in District 12. Her name was Deli Cartwright. She carried with her a worn notebook. Inside were letters written by Katniss but never sent. Addressed to Peeta, to Gale, to Prim, to Haymitch. Dozens of them. Confessions. Questions. Fragments of memory. Some were angry. Some nearly incoherent. Others read like lullabies. They were published posthumously under the title Songs for the Silenced. And in one, written near the end, Katniss had scribbled, "I don't want statues or medals. I want a world where no one knows my name because they never had to live the life I did. But if they do know me, let it be because they listened. Because they heard the song and didn't turn away. And they had listened. At last, they had." A century after the fall of the Capitol, the world of Panem had transformed beyond recognition. Hover trains linked districts once isolated. Borders between them no longer served as chains but as veins carrying knowledge, trade, and people. The ruins of the Capitol itself were preserved as a national historical zone, no longer a seat of power, but a place of learning and reflection. It was renamed the Hollow and Empty Shell, deliberately left uninhabited, a reminder of excess, cruelty, and silence. The name Katniss Everdeen had become sacred to some, controversial to others. While many honored her memory with reverence, a new generation, distant from the trauma she lived through, began to question not the truth of her story, but how it had been told. Among them was a young scholar named Ilya Morrow, born in District 5. Brilliant, sharp-tongued, and unafraid of discomfort, she published a thesis titled Mockingjay Revisited, The Myth of Katniss Everdeen. In it, she dissected the narrative that had formed around Katniss, arguing that in idolizing her, Panem had inadvertently erased the deeper tragedy of her choices. She was not a heroine, Ilya wrote. She was a child of war. A symbol made by desperate hands. We mourn what she became, but we rarely ask what we demanded of her to begin with. The work caused a stir. Older generations recoiled at the idea of deconstructing Katniss. But younger citizens found truth in Ilya's arguments. Not as a condemnation of Katniss, but as a challenge to stop turning people into legends before listening to their pain. The debate spread like wildfire on broadcasts, in universities, across digital forums and open assemblies. And while opinions clashed, a quiet consensus began to emerge, that no one, not even Katniss Everdeen, should be forced to carry the weight of a nation. The Council of Panem responded by commissioning a new center in District 12, the Flame Archive. It would not be a museum of relics, but a living history project. Survivors, descendants, scholars, and citizens could contribute to an evolving tapestry of memory, one not frozen in time, but growing, shaped by every voice, even those in dissent. There, displayed under soft lights in a quiet room, sat the Mockingjay pin. Still tarnished. Still bent. Untouched. On a nearby wall, engraved in a language spoken now by all districts, were the words, "Truth isn't a statue. It's a conversation." In that same year, a small girl named Meal from District 3 went missing. She was 12. Her parents, desperate, released a recording of her humming, hoping someone might recognize the melody. What they didn't know was that the song she hummed was the lullaby Katniss had sung to Rue over a century earlier. When the video circulated, thousands began humming it too. Search parties across districts picked up the tune and echoed it through forests and streets. In a remote field on the edge of District 9, a young farm worker heard the melody echoing through the wheat. He followed the sound and found Meal cold, hungry, but alive, curled in a hollow tree, still humming to herself. They asked her later why she'd sung that song. "Because I knew someone would hear it," she said. "They always do." And once again, the Mockingjay sang. Not on screens or in war, but in the mouths of people who remembered that even in fear, there is music. Another century passed. Panem no longer bore that name. The world had grown, borders dissolved. The old districts were part of a global network of cultures and stories. The idea of games as punishment had long become unthinkable. Hunger had been all but eradicated. Dignity, education, and equity, though never perfect, had taken root. And yet, in the most distant corners of what was once District 12, stories still bloomed. An old man whose face no longer remembered its own youth sat beside a fire. Around him were children, none of whom knew what it meant to fear a capital or hide in a bunker. "Tell us the one about the girl with the arrows," a child asked. He smiled, half blind. "The one who burned?" "No," the child said. "The one who stayed quiet?" He nodded and began, not with a name, but with a whistle. 4 notes. Soft. Rising, then falling. The children listened. And through the trees, as if carried on the wind across generations, the call was answered. Faint. Then louder. A mockingjay perched on a nearby branch, head tilted, as if remembering too. And for a moment, in that timeless pause between story and silence, the world felt whole again. Because she had lived. Because she had spoken. Because she had fallen. Because she had been heard. And in every corner of the earth where injustice is whispered, where survival begins with a song, where someone chooses not to fight but not to bow either, there is still a part of Katniss Everdeen, waiting to be found again.